On this Monday edition of Locked On Grizzlies, I have to apologize to everybody. On X, before the lottery began, I officially predicted the Memphis Grizzlies would pick ninth. That's exactly what transpired. In fairness to me, I said hopefully the good luck carries over into health during the season, and it's not necessarily reflected in the lottery. Hopefully the basketball gods listen to the entire post or tweet, or whatever the hell you call it. We're going to break it all down on this Monday episode of Locked On Grizzlies. Let's lock in.
You are Locked On Grizzlies, your daily Memphis Grizzlies podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
It is a Monday edition of Locked On Grizzlies. We are so happy to have you with us. Yes, I said us. The dynamic duo once again rides. It is I, Joe Mullinax, joined by my co-host, Damichael Cole of the Commercial Appeal there in Memphis, Tennessee. Make sure you're following all the great work he does over the Commercial Appeal through his X account at Damichael C. You can follow me on X at Joe Mullinax. We have plenty to get to today, and we're going to get right into it. But first, this episode is brought to you by PrizePicks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA and use the code all lowercase LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. We are free and available here on Locked On Grizzlies as proud members of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team each and every day. Like, comment, rate, review, subscribe, YouTube, Apple, Spotify, Amazon, wherever you get your podcasts. By all means, hit us up. Let us know how we're doing in the comments. And each and every time an episode drops, wherever you get your podcasts, make sure you're checking out Locked On Grizzlies. This week starts on a bit of a somber note, Damichael, although I have to be honest, we've been doing the show together for a while now.
Yep.
You know me relatively well. I enjoy being right. Right? Like that.
Joe the fortune teller strikes again.
I enjoy being Joe Stradamus. I like it. And unfortunately, it worked out in this case that I was right. I predicted the Grizzlies would pick ninth. That's exactly how it transpired. The Atlanta Hawks have a historic, I want to say historic jump in terms of going
from the play-in to the number one pick is wow.
That is a pretty impressive situation. Both Charlotte and Detroit tumble. Obviously, Memphis tumbled a couple of spots as well. The Toronto Raptors convey their first-round pick, which means San Antonio now has both the fourth and the eighth pick. The Houston Rockets, another Southwest Division foe, has the third overall selection. So thankfully, they didn't get up into the number one slot. But this is a pretty uncertain draft anyway, Damichael, aside from maybe Alexander Sarr. You know, I've seen mock drafts, and we'll talk more about this later in the show, in the wake of the lottery. I've seen some mocks have guys like Reed Shepherd and Donovan Clingan go second or third overall. And then I've also seen other mock drafts have them on the board at 9 when the Grizzlies are selecting. So it seems like outside of Sarr, there's still a lot of uncertainty coming out of the lottery.
Yeah, for sure. That's definitely the case here. I mean, there are certain boards that have a couple of other international players, going ahead of Sarr. I've seen Nikola Topic. I believe I'm saying that right. I've seen him, going at the top of some boards, and the other French forward as well. Zachary at the top of some boards as well. So at the end of the day, this draft right now, it's very crunched up in the top 10. So the idea of getting the guy that you want potentially is still there. So that's something, to be confident in. And of course, in the Grizzlies case, a little bit less confident in because of the fact that, the two bigs, Alexander Sarr, Donovan Clingan, both projected to be top 5 picks, and you fall to 9. We talked about how this could happen, right, Joe? And the idea, this is going to be twisting the knife a little bit, but two teams jumped the Grizzlies, and that's why they fell from 7 to 9. If you remember, as we kind of previewed this thing, 8 was the most likely landing spot because of the fact that there was a good chance that one team would probably jump the Grizzlies. But 2, no one saw that coming. I mean, the Atlanta Hawks, for crying out loud, had a 3% chance? 3% chance of securing, the number one overall pick. So, just goes to show you, I think, Houston, even in the same regards, I think that's the pick from Brooklyn. And even that pick, top 4 was very unlikely for them as well. So 2 teams jumped the Grizzlies, which if you after the top 4, you just go in the inverse standings, would basically mean 2 teams jump to the top 4. I mean, the Grizzlies go down 2 spots. Now they're picking 9th. A lot of options to choose from, Joe. I think, and we'll get to that later in the show. But the point is, I know a lot of people are disappointed. You know, they wanted the top 4 pick and to be in perfect position to get the big man. But at the end of the day, that's the simple option, right? And things in basketball, as we've come to learn, aren't really that simple a lot of times. So now the Grizzlies are going to have to do their homework. There's going to be a lot of scouting evaluations going on because, as I've said in the past, and as you were kind of just alluding to a little bit there, this draft is so tight that this could be one of those years where the guys that go 7, 8, and 10 are all-star caliber players, and then the guy you get at 9 is stuck at the bottom of your bench. Like, you have to do your homework. They got to do their homework for the next month to make sure they get this thing right.
Well, the uncertainty of the draft is every year, right? Like even the LeBron James draft, where I think that was the one where Jerry West, the pick was top 1 protected, and it was the LeBron draft, and Memphis got 2 overall, and it became, I think, Darko Milicic, and it wound up being good that the Grizzlies didn't take Darko. But the reality of all of this being in a place for Memphis where they still have flexibility, right? And I think that is the biggest thing that I don't want to get too existential on a Monday. We're not in a place with the Grizzlies where they need this pick for numerous reasons. One, they've drafted well, they've built the team, they have their stars. The team as currently constructed is a playoff team in the Western Conference. Are they a title contender? Probably not. And they need to do their work within that realm to get past or get up to the realm of a Minnesota, a Denver, a Dallas, those types of teams, the Thunder that aren't going to go away. So I think that this draft, and we've talked a little bit about this, partner, how they approach it, I don't know that it necessarily matters, right? Like, now that they aren't probably going to get Klingon, although, again, I've seen mocks that have him falling to 9. Maybe there's concerns with his foot injury. Maybe there's things that make him fall if he doesn't develop a three-point shot. I'm not as worried about that, but more and more in the modern NBA, you want those 5s to be able to shoot, and right now Klingon hasn't really shown the capacity to do that. Doesn't mean that he can't. He's 20 years old, but at the same time, it's not there yet. I think that, we'll talk more about specific players in the next segment. Now that you're at 9, you can make an argument for anything. Even my anti-G League Ignite, I'm sure you'll bring up Ron Holland here in a little bit. It's not that Ron Holland's a bad basketball player. It's just that he's not going to be ready to be what this team needs him to be. The biggest frustration with the 9th pick is, what is the trade value of the 9th pick in this draft? I think that's a fair question. I have no idea what that value is, and we probably won't know what that value is until draft night, right? Like, what if Klingon falls? What if Reed Shepherd falls? What if somebody can talk themselves into being a really good player is still there on the board? There's a decent likelihood of that. And in that case, that number 9 pick has a lot of value. But sitting here today, falling back 2 spots and not moving up in a very uncertain draft lends itself to, well, what are the Grizzlies going to do? And for me, that leads to more apathy, because this pick is, if it's not a true big, it's not necessarily going to move the needle this season regardless.
Yeah, and I think that's fine. Joe doesn't. You're trying to win a championship over there, Joe. I know I know your mentality on this, but to me, I think that's okay, because at the end of the day, right now you got at least 8 rotation guys. We know you're gonna have 5 starters, and then potentially Gigi Jackson, Vince Williams, Luke Kennard at least off your bench. Brandon Clark. That's another. So that's what, 9 potentially. Like, you got a solid, built-in, ready to play rotation that's ready to go. I mean, I just listed 9 guys just straight off the top of my head. But with all that being said, the thing is, with this 9th pick, you can build, from the standpoint of adding quality depth. This team has weak spots. We'll talk more players, in the next segment. But at 9, you can get someone who can add to the lack of shooting on this team. You can get certain areas. A player here can help this team to improve. And I think that's very realistic. And I think that's okay, because a lot of these guys that you have on the roster right now aren't under contract, for the next 2, 3, 4 seasons. and you can kind of play the look ahead game and say, oh, like a Luke Kennard, if you pick up his team option and you can't, find a partner or whatever the case may be, and Tarek Biberovich never comes over here, now you draft someone in that place that can potentially step in and be your Luke Kennard, maybe to a lesser degree or a different type of degree, but be that de facto off the bench, 3-point sniper, not this upcoming season, but the season after that. So there are some ways where this can work. And you talked about the value. I think at the end of the day, there's always going to be value in a lottery pick, because some teams, certain GMs, certain front office guys just have that smartest guy in the room type of vibe to them. And that's the beauty of this thing, because there's always going to be that GM out there who, we look at certain prospects and a lot of people say, I want to pass on that guy. And he's going to say, I have him top 5 on my board. So I think at 9, with this bunched up that this class is, there are going to be some guys who fall to that point where other GMs have them valued much higher than other guys that are going to go ahead of them. And that could play into the Grizzlies' favor.
I like your optimism. That's positive. Positive. How are you guys feeling in the comments coming out of the draft lottery? I'm agnostic. I'm apathetic. I'm disappointed that Donovan Clingan, Alex Sarr, those guys aren't going to be Grizzlies more than likely, barring some major trade or some sort of thing like that. Damichael makes fair points. I'm thinking that, okay, now they have to address that in some other way. Right now it's the mid-level exception. Now it's looking at trades, and you just kind of move on from that. And whoever's the best on their board they select, I'm okay with. How do you guys feel? Let us know in the comments. When we come back here on Locked On Grizzlies, we are going to talk about some options that could be in play at 9 for Memphis. Stick with us for that. But before we do that, this episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by PrizePicks. Get in on the playoff action. The NBA and NHL playoffs are in full tilt. The world's best players are taking their game to a new level, and you can do the exact same thing with PrizePicks. You can now win up to 100 times your money on PrizePicks with as little as 4 correct picks. You can turn $10 into $1,000 with basketball, hockey, and so many other entries like baseball today on PrizePicks, America's #1 fantasy sports app. Maybe you're a big fan of the WNBA is getting ready to start up. Caitlin Clark setting the basketball world on fire. The WNBA has been growing in popularity, but Clark has accelerated that process. Maybe she's making you interested in the fun, and you want to put her down for more than 30 points. Something along those lines. With PrizePicks, you are playing the numbers, not against other people. Numbers, not others. I like that about PrizePicks. Download the app today and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Again, download the app today and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. PrizePicks, pick more, pick less. It is that easy. When we come back here on Locked On Grizzlies, talking about some names we like if Memphis stays at 9. Stick with us. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I am Joe Mullinax, joined by my co-host, Damichael Cole of the Commercial Appeal there in Memphis, Tennessee, the award-winning Damichael Cole of the Commercial Appeal there in Memphis, Tennessee. And Damichael, I have made it clear. I don't want to say I'm over it, because we have a lot of content to talk about around the draft now that we know exactly.
It's not the end of the world, Joe. It's not the end of the world.
I want to stress that. I agree with you. I've kind of resigned myself to the fact that they're not going to pick somebody that's going to make them better in 2020, 2025. And what I've said, are you trying to win a championship or not? They are not going to make a trade in spite of themselves to be a win-now team. I don't think they've really shown that. Like, they didn't do that with the Marcus Smart trade. It was a win-now trade, but it wasn't something that necessarily hurt their long-term standing. Yeah. So they're not going to do that. They just haven't – I can't possibly fathom them doing that at this point. So I see them picking at 9, to be honest with you, or trading back and accumulating more assets. I could see those kinds of dealings, and they address the big man position in other ways. Yeah. With that in mind, it comes down to best player available. And there's lots of names: Stephon Castle, Reed Shepard, Dalton Connect, who, shout out to the Tennessee Vols. I'm sure you're going to sing his praises at some point. I've seen some people float Zach Edey at 9, which I like Zach Edey more than most people do. I think that's absurd. I would most certainly not take him at 9. Ron Holland, we talked about on a recent episode. So there's going to be lots of options for Memphis. And I have to do more research. I've kind of done the bare, understanding who the people are. I've watched a little bit of tape on all these lottery guys, so I have a basic understanding. But now that we know where we are, I'll do deeper dives. I want to stress I'm kind of okay with anything because of the players that they have in place, because of the fact that none of the names that I just listed, aside from Edie, but Edie at 9 is insane to me. Aside from none of the other guys help what they need, in my opinion. So that issue needs to be addressed elsewhere. And I kind of, maybe in a different way than you, Damichael, get to the same place of, okay, we'll take another ball handler, right? Like take another wing, find the Santi Aldama replacement if you're not going to pay him long term. Those sorts of things, like Ron Holland and Gigi Jackson, maybe combined, those guys can be that type of guy.
Right. And I agree with you to a certain degree here. When from the standpoint of, I don't think you're probably going to get a guy who's going to make this team significantly better. But I think where I probably do disagree is that I do think you can get someone who can make this team marginally better, which is kind of what I was alluding to in last segment. This was not a great shooting team any of the past 3 seasons. In the 56-win season, the 51-win season, the 2, number 2 seed years, not great shooting teams. This past season definitely wasn't a great shooting team. I mean, this is a question for you, Joe. If Reed Sheppard somehow falls to 9, which I don't know if that'll happen, but if he falls to 9, I could see a backup point guard role for him. I don't see if Reed Sheppard's getting. I mean, I love Scottie Pippen Jr., but if Scottie Pippen Jr. and Derrick Rose are beating out Reed Sheppard for backup point guard minutes, it's probably a little concerning to me. I think from a standpoint of who fits, his 3-point shooting, his steal rate, there's a role there for a 15, 18-minute per game guy to step in.
Who did you play instead of? Like, if you look at the roster and you look at the guards, you've got John Morant, you've got Desmond Bane, you've got Marcus Smart, you've got Luke Kennard, you've got all these guys, and that's before I even say a Scottie Pippen Jr. And I agree with you. Somebody that was on a 2-way contract theoretically, it still is, won't play in front of a number 9 overall pick. But I would rather see Marcus Smart and Desmond Bane running that position this season. And to be honest with you, to a lesser extent, Vince Williams Jr. Yeah. I've seen Vince Williams Jr. facilitate that offense. I've seen him do it relatively well.
I like it.
More experienced guys.
I like it, but here's my thing. We saw all of that in the Grizzlies started the season 6-19. Now there are some different caveats
without John Morant.
Exactly. But my point is, we saw when Ja wasn't playing, Marcus Smart as a lead ball handler. I don't want to see that much, Joe. I really don't. Like I do. That's why I've kind of said it a little bit. The backup point guard position, I think Derrick Rose and Scottie Pippen give you good depth. In a pinch, you play Desmond Bane, as you just said there, 6-7 minutes a game or whatever the case may be. But I see value in adding a player there, and you don't have to, put that onto Desmond Bane. Or you could do it like, at Kentucky. Reed Sheppard, Dillingham, and DJ Wagner, those guys would play together. Reed Sheppard would play on the ball, off the ball, which he's shown the capability of doing. He has good spot-up shooting numbers, and he has good, numbers when he plays on the ball as well as a three-point shooter. Guy shot over 50% from three-point range this past season, one of the more consistent shooters in college basketball. He really catches my attention from the standpoint of who can make the Grizzlies marginally better right now. Now, when you look at the bigger picture, right, that's kind of been my out view and just look at this whole thing. That's where the guys like Ron Holland come into play. He's not someone I think you're going to, expect, because we know how loaded the Grizzlies are between the 3 and the 4 spots, with all the guys they're going to be playing interchangeably there. So there probably won't be a lot of minutes for him to go around this upcoming season. But next season, the year after that, 2025, 2026, some time could open up, and that's the year, this player, whoever they draft at 9, could step into a bigger role. So he catches my attention in that way. And then, of course, you mentioned Dalton Connett, my UT Vol guy, a little bit earlier. And to the same degree as a Reed Sheppard, but a little bit different because he's playing a different position. He's someone who catches my attention as a ready shot maker, a ready three-point shooter. I mean, all these guys that we're talking about in this rotation, none of them really scare me as three-point shooters. Like outside of Desmond Bane, Luke Kennard, I'm okay with Vince Williams, taking 3-point shots, and I feel decently comfortable, with him shooting. But outside of that, no one else strikes me as, fear from the 3-point line. Adding a guy like Dalton Connect, and who I think has a decent floor. He doesn't have to be the guy who played a lot in pick and roll and took advantage of all those mismatches, 6'7" big body wing, at the college level. He doesn't have to be all of that. If he knocks down 3-point shots, effectively, he can kind of assume a role in this Grizzlies rotation.
I just struggle with who these guys play in front of. And maybe that's something we talk more about later this week.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
If you take a Dalton Connect, you might as well trade Luke Kennard. If you take a Reed Shepherd, why does Marcus Smart exist? If you have Vince Williams Jr. and you have Reed Shepherd, you put those two people together, and that's essentially Marcus Smart. So do you explore trades with those
better
guys?
Shooting?
Does the trade come out of the draft and they see who's on the board, and then they say, okay, we have depth at this spot now. We'll use this guy to go get a big. We've talked about the hypothetical Smart for Brook Lopez idea. I don't know why Milwaukee would say no to that trade, to be honest with you. I think that helps them a lot. But that's probably a topic for another episode. I just struggle with seeing who any of those guys play in front of. You might be right, but then why are we paying Marcus Smart $20 million, right? Like, why are we paying Luke Kennard $14 million? They shouldn't be in the mix if money is getting tight.
And I agree with you. And that's exactly where the idea of the big man, which we'll talk about, a lot over the next few days and months or whatever, that's where that comes into play. Because if you're able to get someone who makes those guys a little bit more expendable in your Grizzlies rotation, now that decision to add a big man in different ways, it makes it a little bit easier. So you talk about salary matching for bigs that could cost a little bit more. Just off the top of my head, first guy that came to mind right now is Clint Capella. Not advocating for the Grizzlies to get him, just hypothetically speaking here for everybody listening. Let's say the Grizzlies were interested, like, the Hawks just got the number 1 pick, as we just talked about. They might get a guy like Alex Sarr, which means Clint Capella, older big, 22, I think 21 million a year. This upcoming season, the last year of his deal, makes perfect sense for him to be traded. And the Grizzlies could be that team say, hey, we need that center. And I could see, again, if they find a situation where they can, again, get that use that pick effectively, I think that could be a player that they could salary match some things and go get. So depending on what you do with that number 9 pick can kind of indirectly affect the big man conversation.
And we'll talk more about that with some other realistic trade ideas coming up next here on Locked On Grizzlies. But first, there's no screaming, there's no yelling, there's no I'm mad at Damichael, he's mad at me. Because this isn't ESPN, this isn't Fox Sports, this is Locked On Podcast Network, Locked On Grizzlies in particular. We're here for analysis, we're here to break down the news of the day, and that's what you want in your content. Now you can get it 24/7 over on Locked On Sports Today, the first ever streaming channel 24/7 on YouTube. You can also check it out through Amazon Fire and the free TV channels app portion. Lots of amazing stuff to check out with Locked On Sports Today this time of year and all year long. Make sure you are going and checking out Locked On Sports Today. This episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by the good folks over at FanDuel. Big fan of FanDuel. You should be as well. It's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL playoffs, and FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's right, $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and so much more. You can visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Again, that is FanDuel.com/lockedon. Check it out today. America's #1 sports book. Big fan of FanDuel, and you should be too. When we come back here on Locked On Grizzlies, we'll close out this episode talking realistic trade ideas. Stick around. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I am Joe Mullinax, joined by Damichael Cole. We've been talking the reality of Memphis falling to number 9 in the NBA draft lottery. Again, I'm kind of agnostic at this point because none of these guys are Donovan Clingan or Alex Carr.
It's a tough day. It's a tough
Damichael's
day.
doing his best to get me excited about some of these names. But again, I think that the theme that we're going to find as we kind of break down all these different angles, partner, is, okay, you take a Reed Shepherd, why is Marcus Smart still here? Yeah. Right? Okay, you take a Dalton Connect, why is Luke Kennard still here? And there has to be another shoe that drops, at least in my mind, for it to make sense. And I think that maybe people will disagree with me on that. I do think that you have to think about a future where there's no Santi Aldama, because that's probably an extension they may not be interested in paying, especially since Brandon Clark is there. Yeah. There's ways they can approach this that make logical sense. But again, are you trying to win a championship or not? And that's where the trade piece comes in. Now, you mentioned earlier, partner, the idea of a Clint Capella, that now that the Hawks are at number 1, I don't understand why they wouldn't take an Alex Sarr. Maybe they try to trade that pick. I don't know why the Hawks would do that. Yeah. But I think that they have a chance here to kind of reset if they trade Trae Young. There's rumors of them potentially doing some dealings with the San Antonio Spurs, and maybe Young goes to San Antonio, and the Spurs, who have number 4 and number 8 in this draft, do some things, move some pieces around. I'm curious, you mentioned the Hawks. Mm-hmm. Are there other teams beyond them? We mentioned the Bucks too, that you look at the landscape coming out of the lottery and you think to yourself, the Grizzlies can try to take advantage of that team either having too much or too much draft capital, and maybe Memphis wants to move up to the end of the first round and take a Zach Edey. Mm-hmm. Like Edey at 29 or 30 makes a heck of a lot more sense. Or do they trade back at 9 and maybe kind of find themselves wanting to be a little bit more comfortable there? Like we talked about last week, it takes 2 to tango and to make a trade. And obviously we'll have more specific details and deals that we like in the coming episodes here on Locked On Grizzlies. But again, just in the wake of the lottery, what are some things that you're thinking through in terms of what Memphis should look for in a trade?
Joe, I've been kind of trying to lift you up all through this episode, and this might be the part where I try to lift you up the most. And people who listen to the show, this is just my natural, actual thoughts and analysis on this situation. It's not me intentionally trying to fluff up this situation, say, hey, everything's gonna be okay. It's simply the fact that I'm gonna pretty much lay out how this could happen. So the thing that stood out to me after we saw the list was Donovan Clingan isn't necessarily out of the picture just yet. Now, with that being said, I know some people rule out the Spurs. Say, they're not gonna select him. That's the one team that I think may actually select him at 4 or 8 or whatever the case may be.
Can you imagine if Wembanyama and Clingan were next to each other? You're never scoring ever again.
The Grizzlies got to play those dudes 4 times. I mean, that would be something. But
Wembanyama is so unique as a talent that why couldn't he play the 4? Of course he could.
Exactly. So the thing is, here's the thing. If you look at the draft order, and I'm gonna go through it here in a second, and the thing about the draft order is the Grizzlies, every team in front of them pretty much has some type of stability, at the center spot. Now, once you get past Atlanta and Washington with the top 2 picks, I don't expect Donovan Clingan to go in the top 2, and it'd be a surprise if he went top 2. So if we start at 3 right now, Houston has Alperen Sengun. That's the team with the number 3 pick. There's no way in the world I expect Houston. And they have Steven Adams, by the way, who they traded for. So I just don't expect that to happen. And then we just mentioned San Antonio. Some people will say, they got Victor Wembanyama. They're not going to get Donovan Clingan. Actually, I think that's a spot that makes a lot of, sense if you want Wembanyama kind of, not banging against the Jokic's of the world every single game. But with all that being said, that's the next thing. But then 5, Detroit with Jalen Duren. Do they give up on Duren for another big this soon? I'm not convinced that they're willing to do that. Remember, he was the youngest player in his draft class, so he's still pretty young, all things considered. Charlotte with Mark Williams, at number 6. Is the value there for Charlotte to go in a different direction than Mark Williams after he's shown promise as a mid-first round pick, in the last couple years? Portland is at number 7. Portland just traded for DeAndre Ayton. No way they move off of DeAndre Ayton for Donovan Clingan, right? Like, none of these teams in at 8 is San Antonio again. So San Antonio, to me, is the one team right now that makes sense. So with that being said, if you want to talk about Donovan Clingy, I'm less interested in the idea of him falling to 9. That's why we're talking about it in the realistic trade ideas section. Don't think he falls to 9, because at the end of the day, if a team sees him at 5, 6, and he's just creeping up down the board, the Grizzlies aren't going to be the only team picking up the phone. Other teams will pick up that phone to get him potentially at 6, potentially at 7. And I could see a team like Charlotte, wanting to gain more assets. I could see a team, like the Spurs, for example, at 8. Oh, we already got our guy at number 4. We don't need the 8th pick. We got a bunch of young guys already. We don't need to overload on youth. Just let's go ahead and, move this pick and maybe get a veteran player or something in return. And another team jumps the Grizzlies at 8. The point is the Grizzlies monitor this board really closely. I'm not opposed to the idea of jumping up from 9. You got the 39th pick in this draft as well. You got some future draft capital, and maybe jumping up to 6, 7, 5, whatever the case may be, to go get your guy in Donovan Clingy.
Yeah, and I do think that's realistic. I wonder with the medicals, right? Because there's been questions about Klingen's foot. They've limited his playing time. He's never been someone that plays more than 25 minutes in any of these games. How all that will play out in the combine and the weeks to come.
Yeah,
I do think that if there is a silver lining, and again, I want to stress, I'm more meh than I am upset. If there is a silver lining in this meh cloud, it's exactly what you just said. I think that when you hear Houston say things like, "Oh, we think Clingan and Sengun can play together in a 2-man," no, you don't. You are so full of it. You want people to trade with you. You want someone to move up to 3. That's why you're saying that. These agents and these GMs, it's that kind of season. It's that time of year.
That's a good point too.
To hype up everything.
Houston is a prime trade partner for anyone. I mean, they signed those veterans last year, right? Dylan Brooks, Fred VanVleet. They got their young guy, Amin Thompson, Jalen Green. That's a perfect trade partner. Like, why? It doesn't really make sense to me that they would, we're talking about the Grizzlies going in the youth direction. It doesn't make sense for Houston to do that too.
No, it does not. So I think that there is room for movability or malleability. And again, to the credit of the Grizzlies, Zach Kleiman has them in exactly that spot. They can literally do anything they want. And that is a positive. If they like Klingham a lot, they can move up. If they like someone else, they can move up. Again, I don't know why you wouldn't take a big if you have a chance, but I understand. I know, but I don't know. And again, maybe we can explore that existential crisis that I'm having as we go through the next few episodes and days and weeks and months of Locked On Grizzlies. Thank you guys so much for being with us on this Monday edition of the show. The next time we have an episode, it'll be on Tuesday. I think we talked about kind of checking in on the NBA playoffs and that sort of thing and continuing to kind of grind through that. Now that the lottery is complete, we can do a draft lottery lineup. We haven't talked about Stephon Castle a lot, maybe diving into players like that, Castle at 6'6" could certainly play next to John Morant, but the 3-point shooting's a concern. Maybe not prospect profiles yet, partner, but maybe a deeper dive into why some of these guys may fall to 9, even though you could argue Castle was the best player on that UConn team. He was better than Klingham at times. And UConn was one of the most dominant college basketball teams that we've seen in a long time. So, maybe we, not necessarily a prospect, but why would guys fall?
Yeah. I mean, so many interesting prospects to talk about in this 9 range. That's what's going to make the next month so fun. We listed probably 7 or 8 guys today just spitballing. Like you mentioned it, how you got to dive a little bit deeper into the film. I got to do the same thing. Most of these guys are all projected top 10 picks. I want to look at some of those guys that are in that 15 range too. If you follow the Grizzlies a little bit, this isn't a knock at anyway, but it's safe to say that in the past 3-4 drafts, I guess you can say the Grizzlies have quote unquote reached for some guys, right? Joe, I remember, Jake LaRavia and David Roddy, they kind of smacked me out of nowhere. Didn't see those coming. And
that's a great point.
I know some people with Zaire Williams, felt in a similar way, when he landed in Memphis and whatnot. So I think it's not just those top 10 projected guys. I think there's some low lottery, mid-first round guys that we're going to look at too.
I like that. We'll start that process heading into tomorrow. For Damichael, I'm Joe. Make sure you're staying locked in. Like us on comment, rate, review, subscribe on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, Amazon, wherever you get podcasts. Make sure you're checking out Locked On Sports Today. Make sure you're checking out Locked On NBA and all the great podcasts that are a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team each and every day. Again, for Damichael, I am Joe. Stay locked in, ladies and gentlemen. Have a great Monday. Have a great start to your week. I promise I'll be less meh on our Tuesday edition of the show. Have a good one, guys.